Okay, welcome to the Seattle Code Crafters meetup. Today we're really pleased to welcome Andrea Goulet. Andrea helps organizations build communication systems that make collaboration scalable. With experience spanning strategic communication, organizational changes, software modernization, she brings a systems thinking lens to the human side of work. She's a former CEO of a software modernization company and sought after keynote speaker. Andrea is known for making complex ideas like trust, empathy, and alignment accessible to analytical thinkers. Um, so thank you for joining us today, Andrea. And I'm going to let you go ahead and share and start out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Um, I'll give just kind of a very quick overview of kind of how I got to this interesting intersection of, kind of debugging human systems and nerding out about the intersection between communication and software. So, I have a background in sales and marketing. And that led to strategic communication. So working with organizations where essentially you're trying to create messages that move some kind of behavior. You're trying to influence whether or not that's getting people to purchase, whether or not that's getting a stakeholder to actually invest in your project, whatever it is. And so in order to do that job, you have to understand, how people are thinking and feeling. So I got a lot of training. And so I like to say I kind of got a technical exposure to empathy. And in 2009, I went to my high school reunion, and Scott, who is here, Scott Ford, we went to high school together. He came up to me and had wanted to start a business doing software modernization. There were some other things along the way that we had kind of looked at, but he loves fixing bugs. Asked me to be the CEO, and I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, no, I've read your blogs, like the way you think about it. You might not think you are a programmer, but you definitely think like a programmer. I promise you'll be great. So we started a business together called Corgi Bites. The tagline was old code, new tricks. And the one thing was that empathy had to be at the very center of everything. Because as I started to learn, we talked about this a little bit earlier, as I started to learn like XP and Agile and like all these things, when I was reading those books, I was like, this is all about empathy and communication. But at the time, people laughed at me and laughed at us. It was like, you can't say empathy and software in the same sentence because you'll be laughed out of the industry. That was an exact quote from a consultant. And to me, I'm like, oh, I'm going to double down, hold my tea. So we did that. I think we made, an influence. We just exited last summer. So Scott's now working as a lead developer and enjoying coding again. And so I've been doing some consulting and keynote speaking and trying to figure out what's next. So it's been fun to kind of think deeply about some of these things. So I really appreciate being here today. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer as well as I can. And I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right. Everybody see it okay? All right, great. All right. So empathy is, we don't typically think of empathy as something that, oops, hold on just one second. We don't typically think of empathy as something that is, relevant to software or relevant to communications or, or relevant to, how we do organizations. A lot of times we think of empathy kind of as a psychic ability, right? But when we look into kind of what it really is, then we can see that this is really the thing that if we learn the nuances of it, if we learn this kind of as from a technical perspective, then all of the other things that we're talking about, especially when we're talking about agile, when we're talking about, making sure that our software systems are easy to maintain, like this really unlocks a lot of things. So we'll go through some of that today. And first, what I want to do is just kind of look at this beautiful video of, let's say, I'm going to see, does anybody know what this is? You can type it in the chat, or you can. A murmuration. Yep, starling murmuration. And so this is so beautiful, like it's mesmerizing. And for a very long time, people were trying to figure out what the heck is going on. Like, how are these birds like not crashing into each other? And how are they forming all of these amazing things? And for the longest time, ornithologists thought it was what's called thought transference. And so, to me, it's like, oh, the birds are psychic. But, are they really? So, in the 1930s, ornithologist named Edmund Sellis said, their little minds must act together, though I cannot understand it. Yet it seems to me that they must think collectively all at the same time. So, are we kind of the Borg? Do we get to read each other's thoughts? Like, is that how they're working? It turns out that's not. Once we were able to do more computational modeling, and once computers got sufficiently powerful, a guy named Craig Reynolds in the 1980s put together some different behavioral models and discovered that like these complex behaviors, they arise from some pretty simple rules. So first, the birds are trying to not crash into each other. So that's the rule of separation. Next is alignment. So they're trying to go in the same direction as their flock mates. And these are the flock mates that are local to them. So they're paying attention to the interactions of the birds around them. And then also they want to make sure that they're moving towards the average position of their local flock mates. So they're trying to like not fly off on their own. And by each individual bird doing that, that's where all of these complex things arise. So it's less about thought transference. They're not, sending waves across each other's brains. What they're doing is they are paying attention to their surroundings and making predictions about how they should behave in response. And when it comes to empathy, we're kind of in the same boat where we think about empathy kind of as a psychic ability. But the more that we learn about ecology and things like that, the more we can see there's actually a lot of different mechanisms in the world for these types of interactions, especially around hypersocial groups. So bees, for example, they communicate by doing a little butt dance. So they do a little butt waggle. And the dance, depending on how fast they vibrate and what direction it is, they're telling the bees around them, how to find the flowers or what they discovered. And then that propagates out. Ants send pheromones, so they use chemicals, right? And from that, if it starts raining, they can move very, very, very quickly. And again, this isn't, one ant being able to see the entire group. It's them sending signals to the ones around them. And humans do the same thing. And so we predict communication. So we think about, and we have a large, 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 large portion of our brains dedicated to this. So when we're thinking about how we, art is a way to communicate, the way that we have sounds, we have visualization, we have lots around language, even our culture, the way that we pull that together. It's all about being able to predict how we can work together. And this is important. And so, kind of when we look at this from more of just a, zoom out, kind of an abstracted perspective, what we see is that a lot of these social systems, regardless of the species, and there are other, dynamic systems too, they follow kind of three rules. So Donella Meadows has a great book, Thinking in Systems, and kind of says that, complex, dynamic, adaptive systems is kind of the technical term for what we're seeing. But it's got three things. So it's got elements, there's interactions, and then there's also a purpose. So if we look at the starling murmurations, the elements are the birds. They're interacting using these simple rules. And, their purpose is they want to survive as a species. So if they all, kind of are as a group, then that means that, a predator is less likely to get all of them, right? So that's one particular way that species survive. We can also look at forest ecosystems. So we've got trees and plants. There's a mycelium network underneath all of that. So mushrooms, if anybody is interested in going down a really interesting rabbit hole there, right? But they're sending information back and forth. They're sending chemical signals back and forth, again, for species survival. And humans, we do this through collaboration, coordination, and through communication. And so elements are us, right? Each as individuals. We're interacting with the people around us. And then, the reason that we do this is for species survival. And, this isn't new, right? So Darwin, in a follow-up to his, on the origin of species, he wrote a book called The Descent of Man. And in that, he theorized that for some species, this isn't everyone, but for the species that use social behavior as a survival mechanism in general, the greatest number with the most sympathetic members, today that would be interpreted as empathy, would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring, right? So this isn't me just going, oh, this is what I think. Like, if you go back into the history of it, like, it just is what it is. Like, so empathy, far from being kind of this psychic ability or this, you know, feeling of just being intuitive and walking into a room and knowing what everyone's feeling. No, this is actually a full body experience that we have developed over time. We have evolved it. And the reason that we have evolved this complex mechanism as a species is so that because if we can predict how to communicate with someone effectively, then we can coordinate our behavior and we can solve the problems around us. So humans, the biggest way that we, as a species have a survival, instinct is to modify our environment, right? So if we want to build technology, if we want to solve climate change, if we want to, create the pyramids, if we want to take down a mammoth, like it doesn't matter what that is. If we're coordinating in groups, like this is the mechanism that enables us to do it. And the big challenge was that for a long time, we weren't able to really understand what empathy is. But it's been great because over the past 10, 15 years, we've been able to get deeper into the neuroscience of it. So before we were kind of relying on behavioral reports and it was like, okay, here's how people think. But now that we've been able to dive into the science, we've got a little bit more empirical data. And so, there's an infrastructure behind empathy. There's a great researcher out of the University of Chicago. His name's John Decity. And he published a paper about 10, 15 years ago called The Functional Architecture of Human Empathy. And it was so fascinating to read that because it's like he's talking about software modernization, because it was like the concept of empathy needs to be reduced from a monolith into its component parts. And it was like, that's so fascinating. So his work really, this has been kind of his area. And so in 2021, he put together kind of a more comprehensive look at, what are the systems within our bodies, how does empathy actually work in humans? And so there's kind of 4 elements. Critical thinking, which we don't typically think of when it comes to empathy. We don't think logic, right? We think mostly emotion, right? It's that thought transference. Emotion is important. And we also have regulation, because if we are in a state of, individual survival, our sympathetic nervous system gets activated. So we're all stressed. We've got, different chemicals coursing through our veins that dilate our pupils and make our heart race faster. If we're focused on our individual survival, then we're not able to actually relax enough to listen to other people and to collaborate. So regulation is an important part. And then motivation, and this goes up or down. So we'll look at that about how our empathy levels fluctuate. So we'll dive into each one of these a little bit. So cognitive empathy, this shows up as perspective taking, being able to predict kind of in more of a logical sense, like, okay, if you are tired, then you probably are cranky, right? So it's being able to make those associations come from kind of a logical, critical thinking perspective. And so this goes into scenario planning. Like if we're trying to think about how to act, we're going to use our cognitive empathy to, imagine these scenarios. Cognitive empathy plays a really important role in terms of how we approach ethics. So there's a couple of phenomenons, I won't go deep into them, but it's called compassion fade and also the identified victim effect, where we can get so sucked into one person's experience that we forget that our actions have an impact on the group. And so an example here is, if there's a doctor and they're in the emergency ward and there's been a big car accident, they have to use their cognitive empathy to evaluate and triage. Because if they spend so much time with one patient and trying to get them all the way better, they're going to, on the whole, cause more harm. And so being able to use our logic and our reason plays a really important part in how we approach morals and ethics. And then reappraisals, we'll get into this a little bit later too, but reappraisals is essentially pausing and thinking. So we have kind of a gut response, something comes up. So it's being able to have the practice of pausing, like going, okay, that's how my, brain initially wants to respond. What's a better way? Or is that the best way? And so, kind of thinking to it. And this is an important part of collaboration as well. Next, we have affective empathy. This is emotions. The way that I'll go into this next, but the way that we understand emotions has drastically changed. I would say even the past 5 years. And so we used to think that there were kind of 6 basic emotions, if you watch Inside Out, something like that. And then they kind of get more granular from there. But really, what we're learning is that there's kind of 2 vectors. There's pleasant and unpleasant, and then there's calm and intense. And so the way that we share an emotion is we can notice, like if we're, in the grocery store and we can see that someone is crying, like they've got, they're hunched over, like there are signals, right? And what happens is that we end up feeling just kind of a pang of, oh, I've felt that before. And what that does is it kind of acts as I think of it kind of like an emotional compass, where it's, oh, this person is experiencing something, here's how you might want to connect to them. So it's important data, but we experience the feeling first and then we name it later. So if naming emotions is hard, totally fine, right? What's important is being able to notice that people are, pleasant, unpleasant, and again, this is hard for some people, but we'll go into that in a little bit. So this is how we're learning that emotions actually work. And effective empathy, you actually, similar to how I talked about before, if you have too much emotion sharing, then you can get so sucked in where you forget about your own safety, you forget about the goals, like you can be more easily manipulated. So then there's personal distress. So this is regulation. So this is being able to modulate your feelings. So, if you are really stressed out, right, being able to take those deep breaths, this is an important part of nonviolent communication. Interoception, what this is a fancy word for being able to pay attention to the way that your body is operating. So noticing if your heart is racing, noticing, if you're like right now, I can tell like whenever I talk, I get a little nervous and I get a dry mouth. Like I can just tell, oh, that's happening right now. So being able to kind of sense your, the way your body is reacting to your environment. And then as much as you can, there's tons of different practices and skills and things like that. Being able to shift from more of a sympathetic nervous system, these are the actual like systems in our body, to a parasympathetic. So sympathetic is sometimes known as fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So fawn would be like trying to, influence, make them like you, right? So then that way it's kind of, that's a survival technique. Parasympathetic is sometimes referred to as rest and digest. So we're in a state of, our needs are satisfied. And in this state, this is where we can actually operate with empathy. Because when we're in the sympathetic nervous system, when that's activated, our focus is self-survival. But when we're in a parasympathetic state, then we're able to focus on others and we think more strategically as well. And then the last one is motivation, which is pro-social action, which this really is what we want. Like we want people to help each other, right? And so there's different, our empathy levels fluctuate. It depends on where we are. It depends on who we're working with. There are a lot of different things, but essentially our brain does a cost-benefit analysis. So, for example, if you're driving and you see someone who is homeless, but you're on the highway and you're in the middle lane, like, it's not going to make a lot of sense for you to kind of like curve and then put other people into harm's way, to help that one person. So that's an example where, we weigh the costs and benefits of what we're able to do to the people around us to help them. And so, there's a lot of different terms that kind of get tossed around, but here's how I kind of think of them. So we've got contempt, which is, feeling like people who are like you are better than other people. So this is contempt, like you have an affinity for people within who are like you. But othering, so this is where an empathy gap comes in. But you're very prone to othering. And what happens here, Emile Bruno has some great research on empathy gaps. And I think we see this a lot now in a very polarized environment where one political party or something, it's like, oh, you voted for someone, therefore I hate you, right? And so what we see is that as soon as we other someone and put them into a category and we assign a value to that, then our empathy levels for the people who are like us skyrockets and the people for them plummets. And so being able to notice like how all of these things kind of play together, if you're noticing that happening, then you can say, okay, let me modulate my emotions. Why am I feeling this way? So, pity is kind of seeing that someone's suffering, but kind of not wanting to do anything about it, or feeling like you're still better than them, but at least it's like, you see them as a human. Sympathy, I think of is kind of like passive compassion. Like you care, but you don't know what to do. So you really want to help, but maybe you don't know how, or it's hard for you right now to go towards that and really take that leap. Compassion is the seeing someone suffering and then feeling compelled to help. So that's eventually where we want to be, is where even the people who we don't necessarily agree with, we see them as humans, and then we're trying to cultivate environments where we can communicate and we can collaborate. So all of these different things kind of play together. So I see some comments here, that it makes sense. It's the ones that thrive the most where someone's taking care of them. Yep. And then it's the local versus wider optimization. And that's exactly right. That's what we see kind of, in how these different complex dynamic systems operate. So when we look at all this, we learn that empathy isn't mysticism, it's not mind reading or anything like that. It's a mechanism for effective collaboration. So I'm going to tell you some quick stories. Before I do that, are there any questions? I'm going to tell you some quick stories about, kind of how this shows up in a real world kind of experience.
One quick question.
Yeah.
Um, NVC was mentioned, and NVC is like 50 plus years old. So is NVC like the base, or because you said that there's so much new in the last 5, 10 years? So
Yeah, so nonviolent communication is from Marshall Rosenberg. It's kind of a framework, it's a practice, it's something that you can do to kind of help you implement some of these things. So I would think of it more as a framework. And some of these frameworks, like, there's a lot of religion and there's a lot of philosophy, there's a lot of like moral stuff that align with this. They did, so it's similar to, we knew how to smelt, you know, iron before we actually knew the chemical processes. So there's a lot of stuff I think that it's like we've figured out kind of like the social level, like here are the things that work and here are the things that don't. But in the past, I'd say 10, 15 years, we've had access to the imaging. And so that's given us a even more nuanced understanding so that we can understand kind of why things work in a certain way. So, nonviolent communication is a popular framework that we use, but that is not empathy. It's a set of practices that can help you if it's useful, but they're, similar to agile. It's like there's a bajillion out there and it just depends on, what your flavor is. But being able to, I think, know, kind of what's going on at more of a fundamental level can help you figure out your actions.
awesome.
Fortune, I see your hand raised. Oh, you're on mute.
Wonder why it muted me. Thank you so much. Great talk so far. So, of course, I work mostly as a senior enterprise agile coach, working throughout the levels of the organization. And at all levels, I meet a lot of people who are neurodiverse. And I'm
Hmm.
wondering how neurodiversity plays into the graph that you had on the.
Yeah. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. So I gotcha. Yep. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share some stories. The first one, actually, Scott is here. So this one is about him. Uh, but one day, Scott and I, when we first started working together, we were in a co-located space. And Scott had his headphones in. He had been coding. He's the engineer. I'm kind of the business salesperson, right? And we had an instance where like I needed to get his attention. And it wasn't we were trying to do the last responsible moment kind of thing. I had to interrupt him because otherwise, like the client was really upset, right? And I didn't have the answers. So I was like, okay, let me predict, like, okay, every other place that I've worked, if I just pass by somebody's desk and say, hey, you got a sec, that's kind of the standard way that people communicate to get this. And so I was like, oh, I know Scott is focused. I don't quite know how to approach this. So I like snuck over to his desk and I tried to like very quietly go, hi, you got a sec. And Scott got really upset. And I didn't know what had happened at the time. Do you want to chime in about what you did, Scott?
I remember throwing my headphones off and saying, "Well, I do now," and it's just, yeah, it was really frustrating.
He had a strong emotional reaction.
Yeah.
And, at that moment, I like the first thought that came into my head was to rage quit and just be like, what is wrong with you? Like, I am sitting here trying to collaborate. I'm trying to learn how you code. I am trying really hard to do all of this. And this is how you treat me. Right. But then I was able to pause. Right. And instead was able to say, okay, something happened. I don't know what I did, but we have to figure this out because I'm going to have to interrupt you as we grow this business together. And I don't want this to happen. I need to understand what's going on so that we can figure out a more elegant way to do this. Right. So Scott, luckily, then was like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. I'm sorry I reacted that way. Right. And what we ended up doing was coming up with a framework that worked so well for us because in the describing kind of what the experience was like, we had just seen the Christopher Nolan movie Inception. And I was like, what was the problem, Scott? Like, why is that small question? Like everybody else I know, they're just like, no, not now. I need, give me 15 minutes or whatever. And Scott said, and correct me if I'm wrong here. I always give this talk and you're not like in the room. So I try to hold me accountable if I'm not getting this. But we had a really great discussion about how what happened was just the analysis of trying to answer that question required so much cognitive load because he's like, it's not a second, Andrea. Is this like truly a 20-second conversation? It's probably more like 20 minutes because that's how you go. What am I working on? Am I in a good stopping point? How important is it? And so he described what? Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, it reminded me of like there's a scene in the movie Inception where they're like with a dream within a dream within a dream. And I remember saying something like, I was like, it's like I was 7 dreams down. And like just trying to answer those questions, it's like the mental model that I was building in my head at a toothpicks. Because like I feel like that's how fragile some of the mental models I build about the source code that I'm working on is. Just even trying to like figure out how to respond to the hey, do you got a sec? Like I just saw it collapse. Like and it was
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, thank you. I love having it from your perspective because that's definitely the more accurate one. Yeah, and so when Scott described that, I'm like, I was able to use my emotional, like my affective empathy because that's happened to me. I've lost files. Like I was telling, like this presentation, I had to completely redo it from when I gave it in July because when I opened the PowerPoint, it was corrupted, and it's just like 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 you can send even if that exact same thing hadn't happened, I knew the feeling of frustration. I knew the feeling of like, I have to now do way more work. Like, so from there, we were able to do some empathic problem solving, right? He knew like how like I needed to interrupt him and how like I didn't know what to do. So we ended up just running with that and saying, okay, we went back and forth, like, should I do a status message or something like that? And so we ended up just running with it and saying, okay, inception. And so if it's a 0, it's like, okay, what's up? If it's a 4, like, I'm like not available immediately, but give me 5 minutes. Inception, I'll check in later. So basically, if you don't get a response, you just assume that you can't interrupt. This is my favorite. I can tell your inception level is pretty high. I'd also like to remind you that you need to eat so that you don't get hangry, right? And I think this is the thing here, is that this is co-creating solutions together because you're able to use empathy to understand what's going on. Another one, this kind of went the other way, where this is kind of like the opposite of inception, where I was experiencing this. So I have a tendency, I'm more of a big picture, visionary kind of person. I'm like, what if we did this? We could do this. And here's like, Lotta has worked with me before. So I'm like, here is a very detailed plan of this vision. And, Scott is somebody who like zones in and sees a detail of it and then is like, that's not going to work. And I got so frustrated. It was the same thing. And I was like, you're trying to make me feel stupid. You're trying to say that this whole thing, right? And then same thing. I was like, okay, you're going to need to give me feedback on my big ideas. How do we make this work? And in learning that, Scott shared, he's like, I'm trying to be compassionate because I have something that I know, and I don't want you going down this path that's not going to work. And I'm just invalidating this small piece of it. I'm not saying the whole idea is wrong. And so again, we looked at it and, we just did this earlier today where we came up with a framework. So, when one of us feels like we want to impulsively give feedback, right, instead of just chiming in and saying, here's what does or doesn't work, we say, what kind of feedback would you like? Are you looking for macro feedback where it's like, just look at the big themes, tell me if I'm kind of on the right track strategically? Are you looking for micro feedback? And Scott has the best eagle eye, so like he knows where the commas are out of place and stuff. And so if I'm sending something out, like there are times where I'm like, please use your superpower to make sure that I haven't made any mistakes. Or do you just want to be a rubber duck and just have me listen? And again, that's been game changing, but that came from empathy and came from us being able to understand each other. I'll give one more really quick. This happened in a workshop that I gave. And so there was a test engineer, give a workshop called Productive Conflict. And so there was a test engineer. I was having people identify kind of the problems. I call them pebble problems. So it's the things that are right in front of you. They're frustrating, they cause friction, and they're frequent. Like, what are the things? Because that's kind of what Scott and I had discovered. It's like, okay, I have to interrupt you. That's happening all the time, right? So, different people were doing this. There's a test engineer who's like back. I get a lot of this in my workshops, right? People kind of lean back and are very, very skeptical. So walked over, said, kind of, what are you thinking of? And he said, my problem can't be solved. I was like, oh, interesting. What's going on here? He goes, well, it has to do with the developer that I'm working with, because the reason that it's not working is because they're lazy and don't care. And so I can't change that. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. And so this is where having a really technical understanding of empathy can make a huge difference. So I was like, there's an interesting phenomenon called the fundamental attribution bias. And I think I see some patterns here. Are you interested in just kind of exploring it for a second? He's okay. So what this is that when something goes wrong, we tend to attribute it to our circumstances and other people's character flaws. So there was a problem for him. It's like, I'm writing all these test reports and they're really long and I'm giving them all the detail that they need. They're lazy. So it's the character flaw. Like, that's why it's not working. This is super common. Everyone does this, right? So there's no shame if you do this. This is just how we are built. But we can override it. So, kind of looking at a quadrant, we can have, person 1, which is us, person 2, the other person. Like, we've already got 2 things filled out, right? So fine, lazy, and you're doing these really detailed test reports. Can you think of anything that, is in the developer's circumstance and just couldn't? He couldn't. He was like, no, like very walled off. I was like, okay, well, we got another quadrant. Is there anything that is contributing from your character flaws, like that your character things, how you're feeling? So the biggest ones are shame, which is, feeling like you're unworthy or feeling like you're going to lose, the social safety net, or contempt, where you feel like you're better than someone. And as soon as I said that, he goes, well, I am better than him. And it was the first time he had ever said it out loud, but he was thinking it probably 100 times a day. I don't know if this is a common experience. I've felt that way before, right? But as soon as he heard himself say that, it was like you could just tell he wanted to claw the words backwards. And he was like, oh my God, I don't actually mean that. And then everything else opened up. And within the course of 30 seconds, he goes, oh my gosh, do you know what's actually happening? He has ADHD and a really demanding boss. And I'm giving him 50 pages of prose that are really dense. No wonder he can't see it. You know what we could do? I think if I recorded a video and then had some timestamps, that would actually give him more information and it would be way less work. Is it okay if I just pause and email him this idea really quick? Right? That's the power, because then we can solve the problems right in front of us. Right? He didn't have to necessarily wait for manager approval, but that's where we actually get all of the agile benefits of like, let me experiment, let me try these things. It starts by understanding kind of some of these interesting things about how we work. So if anybody here is a fan of Star Trek, Jamil Zaki, who's an empathy researcher, he actually put this he calls this the Roddenberry hypothesis, which I think is great. For those of you who aren't familiar, Star Trek: The Next Generation is the best TV show that was ever made. And so there are two kind of main characters on there. So there's Data, who is kind of an android. He doesn't have an emotion chip, at least, in this series. And he is, curious, wants to do better, right? Like wants to learn, but, kind of goes about collaboration in a very different way than the rest of his teammates, right? Diana Troy, on the other hand, is half betazoid, and so she's the empath, which means that like she can be on a ship on the bridge, and then like there's an alien species in another ship, and she's just like reading it and kind of with certainty, right? But this is not how empathy works. It's how we interpret our identity with empathy. And so we tend to say, oh, I'm like Deanna, and I was like this before I learned all about it. I was like, I can walk into a room, I'm good with people. But if I assign and say, oh, I actually know how they're feeling without actually learning how they're feeling or getting feedback, that's not empathy, that's hubris. That's me feeling like I know somebody better than they know themselves. And that's rude and that's mean and it's disrespectful. And I was like, ooh, right? And at the same time, if we look actually, data from the different like empathy metrics, he's got a lot going for him. And, he's really great in critical thinking. He struggles with the emotion sharing piece, but he wants to learn. And he uses his critical thinking to kind of make sense of things. He's highly motivated to help. And I mean, like, if you're talking about regulation, like he doesn't get flustered, right? So there is a lot going on here. And, what we're learning about empathy is it's saying somebody doesn't have empathy is like saying that they don't have a circulatory system. It is part of what we are. And just like we've got different, ways that we show up in the world, there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of diversity in how we operate with empathy as well. And so where the great stuff comes in, and this is what we discover with Scott. Scott and I have very different ways of operating with empathy. I was very much like I'm Diana Troy. Scott is very much like I'm identify with Data. But when you can learn to collaborate from each other and see each other as strengths, because I struggle really hard with emotional regulation. Like I actually have to take medicine for it because it's so challenging for me. And then like when I get into a dysregulated state, I literally can't think critically. And so Scott, knowing about that, and he's much better at regulating, he's much better at the critical thinking, he can help me when I struggle. And so when we know kind of a little bit more about each other, it's not about getting everyone to this one empathy stereotype. It's about knowing how we work. It's about knowing how we can help each other. And the better we understand that, then the more effective we can be. So diving into this a little bit more, one of the problems, and I might run over, I'm realizing that I am, it's okay. All right.
Just
So,
fine.
okay. So if you have to leave, you have to leave, but I nerd out about this stuff and I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question too, drop it in the chat and I'll try to make sure that I incorporate it. So one of the reasons that we feel this way is because the way that we have understood emotions, it's been very popular, but then as we're looking at the research again, there's a lot of problems. So there's a guy named Paul Ekman. He has worked with the Dalai Lama. He's got a lot of cred when it comes to being the empathy person. And so his whole thing is micro expressions, which is the idea that you can look at somebody's face and then based on like a tiny little eye twitch or something, you'll be able to very confidently understand, how they feel, like with a lot of accuracy. And this was where I was like, oh, I'm really good at reading these things. I can tell, right? But there are a lot of people who struggle with this. But as we're going to see, I think it's kind of a benchmarking challenge. So here are just some of the problems with the methodology. So, the way that these photos were posed, they're all Western expressions. Paul Ekman actually hired actors and then posed their faces. So they're not actually experiencing the emotions that they're supposed to be naming. They had to choose from a forced array. So it's like, okay, here's 6 faces, here's 6 words. So of course, in that methodology, you're going to have much more, inflation in terms of getting things correct or not. But this is kind of how we standardize, evaluate, do you have empathy? Are you able to pass this facial recognition test? So there's been some new research and there's, some updated methodologies, which I think are really cool. So what I want you to do right now is just tell me, looking at these faces, what are these people feeling? What would you say? You can type it in the chat or you can unmute and just share. Pain, anger, anguish, pain, rage, anger, pain. Somebody said joy. Okay. They're rocking out, pain, frustration. Yeah. So the number 1 is terror. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, they're afraid, they're in pain, right? Something. If I then give you some more context and say that, all of the one on the top, they are all associated with the top picture. The one on the bottom, all the faces 4, 5, and 6 are all associated with the context of number 2. Does that change what you think? So yeah, so what are you assessing now? What are you thinking? How has it changed it? Tennis is terrifying. The top is satisfaction and grit. Not sure if it's joy or agony. Yes, I hit it. Yep. So the body language. So I'll share. So the top ones are people who just won a major tournament, and the bottom ones are people who just lost. But if you don't have enough context, you don't have enough information to actually accurately judge this. So take all of the facial recognition things with a huge grain of salt, right? It's information, it's not enough information. So Lisa Feldman Barrett is the researcher who's really on the cutting edge of this. And so she's got a great paper that talks about one of the problems here is that we've actually built in the Paul Ekman's work that looks at facial recognition as certainty into a lot of AI products. So, being able to assess how somebody is in an interview, for example, by looking at their micro expressions. So Lisa Feldman Barrett is doing a lot of work to try to undo that. And then how do we actually build our technology using, kind of more scientifically sound approaches. And so a quote that she has is that it's not possible to confidently infer happiness from a smile, anger from a scowl, or sadness from a frown as much as current technology tries to do when applying what are mistakenly believed to be the scientific facts. So just pay attention to this. Like if you're working on anything emotion related or things like that, happy to email you, things like that. There's a question, how does major cultural bias figure in? There is, right? Different people express emotions different ways. That was actually one of the big flaws in Ekman's research, is that it was all Western. It was all Americans. And so it was all how Americans express. Not everyone does that, right? There are people who are incredibly happy, but their face just is, you might interpret it as, anger or upset, but, and different things. Like for me, when I feel kind of upset and I don't know someone, I go into super nice mode because I go into fawn. It's like, but you would think that I'm smiling. I mean, I'm smiling now. I don't feel threatened, just in case you're curious, right? But there are instances where it's like you would not know that I'm angry, right? We all have this, right? And so the whole purpose is that it's context based. So how do we actually look at emotional accuracy now? William Ikes is the researcher here. And so his methodology, he's been running it for about 40 years, but his methodology is much more sound and I think much more accurate. And it takes into account the context. So here's how it works. So person A, there's the first phase, which is coding. So they share a personal story where there was emotion. Then the researcher says, okay, at this point, you expressed emotion. What were you feeling at this point? So they're naming it themselves, right? Then, that's recorded in some format. So it can be written, it can be, recorded over audio, it can be recorded over video. They've done a bunch of different things. Then they have somebody else, so person B, take the recording and read it or watch it or listen to it. And then at a given point, say, what was this person feeling, right? And so depending, like if you've got writing, you don't have as much context, you don't have the facial features. If you're listening, then you can't observe with your eyes, but you can hear tone fluctuations, right? And so, this gives a much more accurate way to assess how well we infer emotions. And I think it's really fascinating to look at the numbers here. So pure chance, right? Like this is just mathematical pure chance of two strangers, there was no empathy, there was no inference. It's just math, right? How much that's, I'll give you this. This is 5%. Oh, Japanese folks have the concepts of tatame, I'm not saying that correctly, and hone, which is kind of like front-facing motion. Yes, yeah. That's a great, I don't know who, Amanda. Yes, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's a great example, right?
Yeah,
all right.
It's Tatema and Hone, or I might be saying the second one wrong, but yeah, I learned about that a couple months ago. I was like, oh, this is so helpful. So yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. And so then it's like not just the face, but it's like, to like look out for different information, or to like ask different questions in different ways. Like knowing that gives you a different way to approach the situation. It changes the way that you predict how to communicate. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. All right. So next, what about strangers? So person A, records their story, and then person B doesn't know person A. They're a stranger, right? They've never met them. Type in the chat what you think the accuracy rate would be for that. 5%, 50%, 50%, 25, 25, 2. I love seeing this because it's always such a wide range. Cool. 70. All right. 20. Way better than chance. And this is where you can start to see that it's a survival mechanism, right? I don't even know you, but I have a way higher accuracy rate of being able to predict kind of how to respond to you, right? In a way that's effective, right? All right. Friends. What's the accuracy rate there? 80%. 20% chance of predicting how an interviewee is responding. Yeah. 75%. 60%. 30%. Not much higher. Interesting. All right. Life mates that like each other. 60, 40, 40. People are hedging now because of friends. They're like, oh my gosh. Different. I would assume that it's different. Like, so I don't know if I've exactly seen that statistic, but given how all of the other stuff works, actually, no, there is. There is some. There is a researcher. His name is Gottman, and he has a great book called The Science of Trust. So, if you want to nerd out about the math behind it, like he gets into like Nash equilibriums and everything about how we make decisions about who to trust. So, yeah. All right. 35%. All right. The most accurate guessers. So these are the superhumans, Olympians of empathy. These are the people who like are empaths. They're the closest to Diana Troy that you can get. 37. Does anyone get an A in this class? Everyone gets an A. You all get a gold star because you're sharing. 55. There is no such thing as 100% accuracy. Humans have a ceiling of 55%, about 50. So, if you're wrong half the time, you are an Olympian empath, right? And I have a friend, Chris Lee. I don't know if any of y'all know him. He's a big baseball fan. And so he shared it this way. He was like, you know what? 4 out of 10 will get you in the Hall of Fame. And so it's kind of like this, where when we're benchmarking how accurate we are in being able to read another person from their facial expressions or stuff like that, don't think about yourself and don't benchmark yourself against the fictional characters who are empaths because that's fiction, right? Benchmark yourself like the number one person who holds the career record for batting average is Josh Gibson at 37. So like, and it depends on context. Does that change how people feel? Like, did anybody feel like they were higher or they are lower? Like, how does seeing this? I saw a lot of people laughing. I'm curious if it's how this is hitting home. Importance of checking in rather than assuming. Yeah.
If I may, this is actually a really interesting thing that I noticed in myself of my internal mechanism of reading this in other people, when people say, oh, I'm an empath. Because for a long time, I dated someone who said they were empathic, and it always bugged me, couldn't tell why. And then more recently, I talked to someone, they're like, oh, yeah, I'm very empathic. And it just raised my hackles. And I went, no, no, no. That's just not you don't know. And now I have the numbers for it. And it's very interesting to see that internalized before I knew the math.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is the thing. It's like, and this was me. I was that person, right? And it annoyed the heck out of Scott and like so many people around me, right? And like I said, it's very hard to tell somebody that they're operating on hubris, right? I do my best in that area because I can be like, I've been there, I've done that, y'all. But yeah, I mean, this is when it comes to, Fortune, you had talked about neurodiversity earlier. This is why it's so important, and we're going to get into this a little bit. It's called double empathy, where it's not about getting people who are operating from average to conform to this stereotype that we have culturally. That doesn't work. It's about how do we understand each other, so that we can have effective conversations with the people around us. And so, there's a lot of work for people who describe themselves as empaths. And I know it's a hard identity shift to go through, but hopefully the more we learn, the more we know. I see Germandine. Did I say that correctly? Germandine?
Germandine.
Awesome. You have a question?
Yeah, I do. So these numbers are off that setup, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they tell a story, then somebody else listens to it, and then they guess, right?
Yep.
So it's off that setup. So has there been something done about, actually having a back and forth kind of conversation?
Oh my
I assume
goodness.
is going to then increase these numbers dramatically.
It is like you read the next slide. You are a great empath.
Only less than 55% apparently.
Yeah. So here's the cool thing is that these numbers can go up significantly when we have the right kind of feedback. So that feedback loops, important, right? So this is what's called prediction error. So this is the process of how we as humans have to navigate our day because there's a lot of information coming at us. Okay. So without getting too much into the science of it, think of it as a merge conflict, essentially, where you make a prediction, you kind of simulate that, like either through feeling it somatically or, some people visualize it, but it's like you're like, okay, I think this is kind of how it's going to go. Then something actually happens and you compare what, you experienced to what your simulation was. And then if there's a disagreement, you have to resolve the error somehow. Like your brain, like it's called cognitive dissonance, where it's just like, I can't do it. So you have to pick one and go with it. Right. So let's look back to the story of me and Scott. So my prediction there was like, okay, I'll ask if he's got a sec. Right. Like, because that's what I think I need to do. So I simulate it. I'm like, okay, you know what? He'll tell me if he's not available. That's what everybody else has done. Compare, like he flipped the desk. Like, so what I experienced was like so far off from what I had imagined it was going to go. So then we have to resolve the error somehow. So first I was like, he's a jerk. I can't work with this person, and then you start getting into all the stereotypes. You start see, that's the fundamental attribution bias that I talked about earlier. That is it rearing its head, right? But the cool thing is that we can use our cognitive empathy and we can do what's called a reappraisal. So we can be curious and we can use compassion. And so we can think of a different framing. And this takes practice. It's very hard to do. I did not say that, Scott. Says stupid tech bro for people who are watching. Just want to be clear. But I said, yeah, okay, I need more context, right? I want to learn. So that was the reappraisal. Something went wrong. Scott's actually a nice person. This is a situational thing. We need to figure out what's going on, right? So then when you enter there, then you can start engaging in empathic problem solving. So I'm like, okay, what's the next message that I can say? If I say, Scott, you're a jerk, you need to learn how to, like, that's probably not going to, go with empathy. Right. But if I think about it and say, okay, something happened. I can tell that you're struggling. I don't want to hurt you. Like, I never want to do this again. Help me understand. Right. And then he could have been pissed off again. Right. There's no way I could have known. But we keep going and making these predictions. And this is just literally how humans navigate the world. And prediction error is how we learn. Right? If we had no prediction errors, we would have no innovation. Truly. Scott Page has some great work on that. It's called the diversity bonus. Empathy plus conflict equals innovation. Scott and I, like, back to the thing, we would not have come up with that great framework that worked so well if we didn't have the conflict and if we hadn't had the motivation to actually figure it out. Right? So this isn't about never having conflict. Right? It's about learning how to navigate conflict by understanding each other, being able to regulate, being able to understand what emotions are at play, and being able to figure out what our motivations are. And let's look at this real quickly with team dynamics. So somebody had mentioned this earlier. When you have double empathy, that's where things are awesome. And double empathy is not like, oh, each person is trying to meet this like fictional stereotype. It's each person is operating out of humility, but they're doing the best they can. And they're learning through feedback and through interactions about how to help each other, right? So if we look at data, again, it's like your ability to infer emotions is highly intriguing. I know that emotions are important and I'm curious and I want to learn. I think that's one of the coolest things about Data is like he is so insatiably curious, right? And okay, he can't like infer it, but he is using his cognition and his logical thinking to try to make sense of the situation, right? So engaging there, right? And then, Deanna Troy is like, your ability to do analysis is amazing. And sometimes my intuition can be overwhelming. Like when that happens, can you help me? Right. And so the more we know ourselves and kind of how we operate, the more we're operating out of an environment of psychological safety and trust, then we're more likely to share and be vulnerable. And then when we have this back and forth where we both feel seen and we're both open to influence, we start solving our own problems. And that is so fun. That is so fun. Right. And that's where we get flow. That's when agile starts unlocking. That's where it's like, okay, let's run this experiment. Okay, how did that go? Oh, cool. Let's try something else. There's problems when it's one-sided. So Data in the show, there's an episode where it's revealed he has a brother, Lore. And Lore has an emotion chip, right? So he has an advanced positronic brain where he can do emotions, but he's maniacal, right? So this is an instance, empathy, like if we only think about empathy as being able to infer emotions, then we end up looking at very dysfunctional empathy because it can lead to manipulation. It can lead to, hurting people. It can lead, there's Barbara Oakley she studies pathological altruism. So she's got a whole research agenda there. But thanks, Raul. Sorry I'm going over, but I appreciate you being here. Hopefully you'll be able to watch the rest of it in the recording. Right? So Diana then is like, I need to set some boundaries. I'm not going to be as open with you as I am with Data, right? Because my personal safety is at risk, right? So basically I'm like, I don't know. I would help you. I'm a helping person, but I don't know. We also have another character, Dr. Pulaski, who's a human. And this is another example of unbalanced empathy. So, Dr. Pulaski has a very she's operating out of pure contempt and believes that humans are the only people who should be Starfleet officers. She doesn't even acknowledge, Data's sentience. She sees him as a machine. So that's operating out of contempt. She's not going to have empathy for him, right? She's not willing to engage the emotion sharing, and she has no motivation to learn. So even if Data is like, I really want to learn, I'm interested, right? She refers to Data as it. Like she refuses to use a personal pronoun that he calls himself he, and she's like, no, you're a machine, you're an it. You don't have this capability. You should just stay in engineering just like everybody else. And so there's this whole arc of exploring that idea, which is one of the reasons why this is such a great show. And then we've got, just the toxic workplace where we've got double contempt, where just, things spiral really fast because then people are operating out of spite. People are operating, so, this stuff it makes a difference, right? But we can learn and we can grow, right? We can change our mind. We can, take care of ourselves so that we have the energy to engage. There's a lot here. So I like to think as I'm navigating throughout my own workday and kind of the way that I learn, I like to conceptualize it is that I think of empathy kind of like being a DJ as I'm walking through life, right? So sometimes I'm highly motivated and, sometimes I'm really engaged in someone, but then I'm like, oh, wait, am I getting too engaged? Okay, let me step back and think a little bit more critically. So you can think of these kind of as levels, right? And as, similar to how a DJ might adjust the levels on his board while people are dancing, as a way to interact. That's kind of how you can do this. So, the inferring somebody's emotions, that's just a small piece of it, right? And everyone, I think, has their own empathy profile is kind of how I think of it. Similar to how I have a profile when it comes to gut health or something. It's and, like I said, for me, I would say that I'm pretty accurate in terms of the, emotion sharing. I don't know if I actually am, but I've been told I am. There's the regulation piece. I really struggle. And so for me, I know if I'm in a dysregulated state, I'm making assumptions, I'm operating out of self thing. So everybody's going to have their own kind of baseline. This is called trait empathy. But then there's also state empathy, where it's based on, like we had talked about that empathy gap. So if you're operating with someone, if you're interacting with someone who there's a different power dynamic, it's going to be different. If it's somebody who is your best friend, you're going to show up different. If it's somebody where you feel like it's a threat, you're going to show up different. So everything fluctuates throughout the day. That's normal, right? And when we can learn to pay attention to it and then learn how these different things interact, then we have more of a technical capability to change our emotions, to change our states, to, think more clearly about what we can say. We can never, ever, ever control how somebody else reacts, ever. But we can control our response. And through learning, right? And sometimes it makes sense to just not engage, right? Especially if there's things like personal safety, right? And then also, I think when we look at this, it's like we can find ways to embed empathy into our culture and in our code. We talked somebody had mentioned earlier about chit chat and kind of like the importance of, Eleanor Ostrom has some great work there on Tragedy of the Commons. And one of the most effective ways to manage a fixed resource, to have a group. So she looked a lot at like people who are fishing and they have limited stock. Like, how do they manage that? Because if everybody fishes to the point where they're going to like take most of it, then everything will be depleted. One of the most essential things is chit chat, which isn't forced fun. It's having the opportunity to have localized conversations, right? That are unstructured. And this is where most of the knowledge sharing happens. So if we've got in our teams, like every single minute of the day is scheduled, we're missing out on a huge opportunity. So these are some things here where it's like, okay, gratitude, making sure we're holding people accountable, right? And this is where all of those different agile practices and all of those different things about how to have healthy teams, they suddenly start to make sense because we understand the fundamentals of why they work. And then I don't know, for me, it's like once I figure out kind of the underlying piece of all of it, it makes it so much easier to figure out what the specific intervention that's going to be helpful is. So I hope that this has been helpful. I know I ran a little bit over. I really appreciate everybody sticking around. So here's how to get in touch with me. And just throwing it out there, it's been about a year. Scott and I, I mentioned we have wound down Corgi Bites. I've been spending about a year. I've been doing keynote speaking, individual consulting, but I'm really excited about trying to embed on a team. So, looking at full-time roles. So if anybody has anything there, it's like, I don't even know kind of what kind of role it would be, because it's like, this is a really interesting skill set. But just, I'm starting to kind of put that out there. So thanks, everybody. Marco, you said dysfunctional empathy. Does that lead to sociopathy? So yes. And there's also some interesting research about like different conditions to that. And so this is like the trait versus state empathy. So they had people who were diagnosed with psychopathy, so psychopath. And, overwhelmingly, if you've listened, like Brene Brown says this, a lot of people, it's like, oh, if you don't have, the only people who don't have empathy are the 2% who are psychopaths. It turns out that's not true, because it's about propensity. So it's a propensity challenge where they don't immediately think about compassion or anything. But in the brain scans and stuff, when they are told to do it, it happens. So it's not a inability to do it. It's just like you never think of it, right? And so you're always operating out of self-interest. And so there's some interesting interventions that are starting to emerge. I haven't seen kind of the follow-up of it because it's kind of newer research. But I think that, to me, I find this endlessly fascinating. And I think the more that I understand about this, the more it makes me patient, the more I understand, like, okay, humans are just humaning, and humaning is hard. And you're humaning the best I can. You can. I'm humaning the best I can. When we can create the conditions where we can communicate effectively, then that's how we get stuff done. So I really appreciate everybody. And I'm happy to stay around for questions, however long people want, but I'm really grateful. Thank you for letting me nerd out.
This has been really excellent. Thank you. it's always amazing to me how like really we call ourselves crafters and software crafters, and like how being a crafts person, whatever that is, but how it bleeds across. It's not just about writing software. It's not just about building things. It's about becoming a team and working with people, and like all these things are relevant. And I noticed Fortune kind of asked the same question that I'm going to ask is like, how how do I apply this at work? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
it's important. And I've been on those teams where we have empathy and we're a really good team and we're really connected and we understand that maybe it's not time. I can't talk right now, or I'm going to come back,
Yeah.
or I need to approach it, etc. Um, and yet yeah, I've been on the other side of that also. And we don't, this is not something that comes with learning to be a software developer usually.
Yeah. 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 I think it's hard. There's one thing that I'll mention from what you said earlier. Part of the reason why I got so interested in this was because we had launched Legacy Code Rocks, which was like all of the people who love mending, right? And as soon because Scott was very much this like, I'm not a maker. I love fixing stuff. Like I love, making things better. And as I started to know more people who kind of had that same mindset of Scott, I'm like, this is the most compassionate community I think I've ever met, because you're thinking about the people who are coming after you. Like legacy by definition is something valuable that you're passing along. And so people who take the craft mentality, who are approaching, like you have then the motivation to name a variable in a way that's self-revealing, right? To make sure that you are, updating the documentation so that it's in line and somebody's, not going to get really confused, to refactor. And like all of that is rooted in empathy. Like that is pro-social action. And so what was really interesting to me that I really wanted to dissect was here are people who empirically are demonstrating compassionate and pro-social behavior, and yet they are calling themselves like, I'm bad with people. Why? Like, and so that was kind of really, really the spot. And that's when it's like, oh, here's all these different ways that it's working. So I think one of the things at work is like actually remember when you are coding, right? Do the stuff that you're doing every day, right? So that's a way that you can do it in the code is you're using empathy. Like how many times has it been like, so now I'm guessing a lot of people are using things like Claude Code and Cursor and things like that. So an example, I call this a human validation layer, where it's getting into the practice is kind of like a reappraisal where, okay, great, it just wrote all this stuff. Do I just go, boop, it's good? Or do I take the time and actually look at it and think about the people who are going to, interact with this code that I'm committing? And that gives you a different lens. And so that actually is a great practice. And that is an empathy driven practice. So by doing that, you're actually helping yourself when it comes to humans too. I think it's also it's also important to mention that there are times that you can't. So for example, if you have a boss who is a jerk, it's limiting. Like there is a power dynamic at play. And the best thing you can do there is to have compassion for yourself. I didn't get a chance to talk about self-empathy and self-compassion. Kristen Neff has great work there. But by really recognizing, and it can be something very paused, and it's like, okay, you are clearly suffering. I hope you find peace, right? And then giving yourself compassion. You do not have to engage. You do not have to learn about their perspective, right? And that's that double empathy. So if you're on the side where it's like it is really imbalanced, recognizing that sometimes it's not safe to engage, but having that compassion and doing the reappraisal is important. I see a bunch of comments. So Lada, you've got your hand raised, so I'll do you first. And then...
Now I have two questions. You said a boss
Yeah.
who's a jerk.
Yeah.
And earlier you were like, the first reaction is he's a jerk, but then I'm like, he's not. how do you know the difference? I mean, with Scott, it's clear. Like you've experienced
That's
Scott a
actually,
lot.
I love that. That's a really good, because that is me doing the fundamental attribution bias again, right? That's me assigning that the problem is the character flaw, where really it's like, how does
So you
somebody's
think
behavior
it still
impact
can
me?
be that, right?
Yeah. And I
Like
think that's the thing. It's like, that's a natural reaction, right? But then being able to recognize, like, oh, I'm calling him a jerk because he's calling me names and shaming me in front of the team, right?
right, right.
And being like, that's inappropriate behavior. That is him trying to make me feel small, right? So that's where the self compassion can be really important. Maybe try to listen if there's a grain of truth in the feedback that is being shared, but at the same time, like, taking it with a grain of salt. And also doing what you need to do. So if the environment gets way too toxic, right, look for other options,
That
right?
makes
So
sense.
that, yeah. So, and there, I think the other thing is there is no right way. So that's the hardest thing is especially for those of us who like to see things execute and it's like pass fail, right? We like the very like binary, like I got an A, right? Like you got an A just because you're human and you're doing your best, right? And like the A comes from the learning, the A comes from the growth, the A comes from the, trying to make things better and do things a little bit better, recognizing that you're never going to be perfect and giving yourself some grace, giving other people grace. I'm gonna look
I
at
have,
so
sorry,
yeah,
I had two questions. Can I ask the second
yeah,
one? It's
yeah, sure.
related. So in that moment where you're like doing this attribution about jerks, right? Oh, I got a reaction. I was coming from something good. So I have a lot of empathy for myself. And then I see this and it feels so unfair. How do you stop that first reaction of
You
slap
can't stop
back
the first
or
reaction.
okay, and
Yeah,
what do
so
you do next to so
it's
how
the
do you
reappraisal.
and how
Yeah.
long did it take you and like what do you have tricks?
Do I have tricks? That is a great question. So first, it's a skill, right? It is a skill. It's kind of like think of it this way: knowing when to commit. Like, we all. I'm assuming that like the consensus here is that smaller commits are better for the code base's health, right? There are times where it's like we let an interaction go so far and it's like we can tell that we're operating our resentment, like we are going in that, like we're blaming people, right? So that can be an indication of like, oh, let me check in and reframe, right? Let me check in and see what's going on. So think of it as like commit messages for your human communication, right? So as it's hard. I mean, like Lotta, you've worked with me. Like I really struggle sometimes with like the small commits. I just want to keep going because I want that definition of done, right? I want that emotional satisfaction. So I think for me, um, I tend to look at when. No, okay. Here's what I did. I think that was the most is pick one thing, like one behavior where a reappraisal is going to be helpful. So for me, it was when I feel angry, I want to be able to develop the skill to tell someone how I feel in the moment and why. So then that way it's something that's very concrete and very like, so I, remember going to a conference and it was like somebody really hurt my feelings, but I was so stressed out. I literally like didn't even know what to say. And then that would carry. But now practicing that over time, I'm like, okay, I feel angry. Okay, how do I feel? Right. And it's taken years to get to the point, but now it's like, it's easier. So that I think has been the thing that's helped me the most is to pick one thing that feels concrete to you. Steve, I see your hand up.
So I'm a huge fan of deliberate practice, the very act, the structured act of deliberate practice. And I can remember there have been times with skills that I do that, but I took a crucial conversations course and we had a group of people that got together afterwards and we created deliberate practice sessions
Yeah.
where we practiced it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I've applied that on a number of different levels. So trying to find with some realistic but still contrived situations with a friend, with a trusted partner, things like that, where you can practice this, helps to give a little bit of a habit
Yep.
to it, a little bit of a seed sprouting.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think
Thanks.
one of the cool things about this is that, like, when you feel powerless, you can do this, right? You can give yourself compassion. You don't have to ask for anyone's permission to start working on this yourself, right? Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is a great book to read there about the autonomy that you have about how you interpret your own emotions and your own feelings, even under hugely, toxic places or environments. So I think there's yourself, right? And so for me, there was that self practice. What I found, I had limited success when it was like, okay, I'm going to yoga every day. And I'm going to, like, that generally kind of helped my health, but it didn't help me in the moment. And so, like, recognizing, okay, the thing that is making me dysregulated is that somebody's offending me. And then I get so overwhelmed, I can't think about how I'm feeling. I want to get better at that skill of naming how I'm feeling. Because I was at the point where, like, I couldn't even name it. Like, I could feel it, but I couldn't name it. So, I mean, that was the first step is, do I feel angry? Do I feel embarrassed? Do I feel shamed? Like, whatever it is. And that's completely internal, right? Then when you have, people around you, like Scott and I have deliberate practice. Like one of them, so Scott and I also got married. Did I mention that earlier? Like during the conversation? Oh, we got married 3 years after we started our business together. So we had an extra motivation. And so one of the things we learned in couples counseling actually was a hack of, I'm going to hold up a mirror. With my friends, I'll sometimes say, I'm going to give you some spinach in your teeth feedback, where I'm going to say something and you're not, believe me, it's coming out of kindness because this is how you're showing up and I don't want it to be that way. That's like, I have friends where it's like, they don't want that. I have other friends where it's like, they eventually know it's coming from a kind place, right? So that's that kind of like negotiated signals. Yeah, but I think it's like, there is no right way because the best way is going to be whatever emerges from your specific context. So, Jemadine.
Hi, thanks. Lana, I just wanted to throw this out there for you and for everybody else in this community that, if you're a curious person, a data-driven person, something that works really well for me in these situations is like I'm considering every communication to be just information that I'm gathering, right?
Absolutely.
And then I just try to assume good intent from the beginning. And then I'm keeping the conversation going over time to then check any assumptions that I might have to see if the data actually backs them up.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you feel more, let's say your boss is an actual jerk and over time, no matter what you do, they still are a jerk. You're going to feel like you've got some data to back that up, like, maybe my first assessment was actually correct. And sometimes it goes the complete other way of, wow, I was totally off. They were just having a bad day. They're actually an amazing person, which is backed up by all of this
Yeah.
data that I've collected over time. And that, when I'm coming at it from that, where it's just like, oh, this is a very interesting situation. I'm going to collect some data and do some research on this.
Yep.
That's just something that works really well for me. I thought it might work well for other people in this community.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely true. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ellis, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, this is all kind of, and I know we've kind of touched on this, but I mean mostly just rephrasing the question because I know one of my favorite things that someone I know talks about is we learn everything we need to about communication on the playground in kindergarten, and then we forget it. So how do we prevent that forgetting? How do we continue reinforcing that? How do we increase instead of having this big downward dip of, oh, how did I forget this? Of course, this makes perfect sense. Where does that come from? How do we stopgap that?
That's interesting. Give me a second to think about that. So my initial response is I did not learn how to communicate on the playground. And I am very grateful I do not have the communication skills today that I did when I was in kindergarten. I was incredibly dysregulated. I have some neurological conditions that were not diagnosed. And so I would offend people. I didn't know why. I got made fun of. I was bullied. When I would tell the teacher what was going on, I was told that I was a tattletale and I didn't know. I just like literally couldn't make sense. And like even in high school, like, you know, I would get canceled. Like I would walk into school one day and it was like all my friends were just like mad that I had done something and I didn't know why. And then when I went to, so for me, I don't know that I actually agree with the premise. Um, I'd have to think a little bit more. I think maybe the intent of that might be to remember that you are born with the capacity. I think that's probably part of it, is that if you are stuck in communication patterns that aren't serving you, like as humans, like maybe we take it less from kindergarten and more to like in utero, where we can look into different ways that just humans have evolved, right? Like that fundamental attribution bias, for example. Like that is such a common experience. And like remembering, like that's a learning thing, right? So it's something that happens in our brains, but we can learn how to navigate it. We can learn how to use that as data and as kind of a different way to analyze. But yeah, I don't know. That is such a fascinating question that now it's going to be like in my brain for the whole day, and I super appreciate that.
That also just brings me back to one of my favorite, like one of my most life-changing statements I heard was that everyone's default setting is good.
Mm,
Pending any other outside sources, people usually choose good.
mhm.
There's a
Yeah.
book on that, the good inside, and then she talks
Ooh.
about how for parenting, and it's about how all the emotions are okay, but we need to focus on regulating, stabilizing,
Yes.
helping regulation, which what one
Yep.
of you bring that up too. And that's what I need help with as well, because my parents didn't help me regulate as much, or it's not on them, it's on me, I guess. But we learn from everything. Like if we forget our capacity, it's because we're conditioned to whatever the current values are, right? Family,
Hmm.
school, I don't know, church,
Yeah.
religion. We are programmed, but we can, if we're programmed, we can reprogram to whatever we now find or know, right?
Yeah. One of the things that's been valuable to me is kind of learning a little bit more about like what is the what is the purpose of an emotion? Because like an emotion essentially is something that is giving you data in a somatic way. And so anger is the like it helps you recognize injustice. It helps you recognize when things aren't fair. And so to me, it's like, oh, I'm feeling anger, which is something that I've really started. Like, I've had to be in therapy for a long time to just like be able to experience anger because it feels so dysregulating for me. But being able to just say, oh, no, no, okay, my body is sending me a signal that something's not fair and something's not equal here. Okay, let me then go into cognitive, like, let me analyze why. And that has helped me with regulation a lot because then I don't feel so stuck. I feel like I can listen to, it's almost like, that information is kind of encapsulated into the somatic experience. And being able to then see what information is hiding underneath that has been helpful. So I love how engaged y'all are. This is like one of the best presentations. I feel like I've just really appreciate all of the conversation back and forth. I love learning from all of you too.
You know, one of the questions that I have is there have been some studies in the 60s and now being revived current day talking about um, psychedelic therapy and increasing empathy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I want to be careful because I haven't read the studies, so I don't want to put like, I'll just give my first impressions from the anecdotal things that I've seen. Yeah, I think that medicine can be helpful, right? There absolutely are like chemical challenges. Like for me, getting the right medicine like changed the way I was able to regulate.
Mhm.
So to me, I think it's like, you know, everybody has kind of their own cocktail of things.
Hmm.
And I think it can be very valid to have, different types of therapeutic interventions.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting to explore, right?
Yeah.
To me, I think some of it, like, I remember following some of it and it's like it looked really promising, but then it's like, oh, there's some methodological flaws to how it
Yep.
was, right? So I think it's like,
Yeah.
follow the science,
Right. And you
follow the
have to be
science.
able to read and analyze the paper as well too, and know
Yeah.
that background. What was interesting to me is it wasn't a therapy where you had to continually take it. It
Yeah.
was just one dose of a range of different psychedelics, and people tended to have a different behavior after that. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and there are some things. So there's some non-medicinal interventions. One that I've used is called EMDR. So it's the
Yep.
eye movement. Like that has changed me. Like I had some very significant trauma in my past, and that helped me so that I wasn't like in a loop. Like I had PTSD
Hmm.
around it, and it
Yep.
made a huge difference. And so now it's like I can talk about the experience without getting emotionally sucked in. So I think that's the thing. It's like whether or not it's chemical or, whatever the therapeutic intervention is, I think we continue to be
Hmm.
curious. We continue to recognize that there is no one size fits all. Um, and we just practice really good science.
Yep. Agreed. And
So,
curiosity, which is good
yeah,
science.
exactly. Yeah. Scott.
Um, while you all were chatting, it reminded me of an episode of the podcast Radio Lab that talked about memory, and um, there have been a lot of studies done along those lines, and they had really nice, really fun conversations with the researchers in that episode. Um, and evidently in mammals, or at least in mice and humans, it appears that um, when we um, when we access a memory, um, it gets overwritten. So it's like, and I think that might be kind of what's going on with EMDR, is that you you access a memory, like every time you're recalling a memory, it's like the quality of the memory degrades a little bit. And I think this might also like be the underpinning for why like cops want to get somebody's first impression, because the more that they remember what happened, the more opportunities there are for that memory to then change, just because the act of accessing it is an opportunity for the memory to be slightly altered. And I think that might be what's going on with the MDR, is that, by having you access a memory in a controlled setting and ask you to then imagine what you would have rather happened, I think it almost like the memory gets slightly rewritten so that it's a less bothersome memory now. And so like anyway, the idea that you're like, as somebody who works with data all the time, right? Like I would never design a system where accessing the information, created such an opportunity to change it. But evidently, as meat bags, that appears to be how we're wired.
We should fire the architect.
Mutable memories.
Amanda, I see you. I'm going to make a comment real quick. There's a great book called How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And this was the book that broke my brain around this whole topic. And so she's really spearheading the field of neuroconstructivism, which uses prediction error, which uses so I've leaned on her work very heavily. She is the one who is most critical of Ekman's work. But she talks a lot about that in terms of how we use emotions as memories and like how memories work. And, it's she's a neuroscientist, so it's more empirical. And that book, if you're interested in learning about like some of the nuances, but I think just brains are fascinating. Humans are fascinating. And when I was reading that, I was like, oh my gosh, it's like object-oriented programming because we have instances. Like she literally describes this. It's like it's classes and instances. So I have a whole thing on LinkedIn that I wrote where it's like an emotion is a class, where it's a pattern of how I feel in which context I have labeled that in a certain way. Your labeling can be very different, but then that gets instantiated in a specific context and that instantiation is different from the pattern and it's different from a past experience. And I was just like, so
Is therapy your garbage collector at that point, Andrea?
that's a great way to phrase it. I love it. And reappraisals are my linters.
Yeah.
I love it.
Oh my gosh. No, and along with that line, like the memories thing is like people will say, oh, you may not remember all the facts about something, but you remember how you felt about it. That's true. Like I'll go back and I look back at old memories and I'll be like, maybe because you're older, maybe sometimes wiser, depending on the situation. You go and you look back on something and you're like, oh, maybe my memory is flawed, or oh, maybe I have new information about how I could have handled that. So it helps you kind of, I guess, rewrite or refactor your memory in that
Yeah.
case. Because you're going, hey, I didn't quite understand that, and now I do, so let's make it work better.
Yeah. Yeah, when it comes to memory and recall and everything, it's interesting too. So this isn't a diagnosis, it's a quirk of the brain. I have aphantasia,
Oh,
which is
nice.
I don't visualize. I didn't know that people like saw images as like movies in their head.
You and I are
Like,
opposites. I'm
oh
like
yeah? Are you a
pictures
hypervisual?
all the time. Well, I also have hearing difficulties, which actually
Okay.
means I'm more likely to picture things. Because deaf
Yeah.
people, because you can't hear, they might not have an internal voice in the same way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's
That's
two spectrums to that
Yeah,
too.
there's so much research on just like how different we are, but that's so good. Like that really serves us because that like when we can collaborate, like that's where we get all the new ideas and the new perspectives, you know, and like if everybody was the same, like we would be a monoculture and there would be a lot of risk for us getting wiped out on a social species. So the level of diversity is healthy. But yeah, like so for me, I have a like, you know, I've seen Scott like literally we work together like 24 hours a day for 15 years. If I like if he's not in the room, like I'm like he has glasses and he has dark hair and he has a beard and wears graphic tees. Like I can pull out properties, but I can't visualize his face at all. And it's like so the way that remember things is in much more of a somatic way. So I remember how I felt in a specific instance and I might associate some words with it. And I think that's the other thing too is like you know, we got to triangulate different memories. And that's kind of how we, you know, start to learn some of the truth is by, you know, getting to the point where we can learn about different experiences and look at things from different angles. And the more data we have, the more, you know, the more we can trust.
I worked with a gal who had severe facial aphasia,
Mm-hmm.
and literally almost every day, worked with her for 6 months. After about 6 months, she got to the point where she had built enough other memories around me to trust me. But now when I see her 3 years later, I have to completely introduce myself and say, "Yes, I'm Steve Quo. We worked." She's like, "Oh yes, I remember." So I mean that's huge, and that was part of the journey of growing to be
Yeah.
more empathetic.
Yeah. Well, and it's like knowing how to respond. And I think this is the thing is that if she hadn't said that, right? Like you having that context makes a big difference.
Yep.
Right. And then that's an example of double empathy, where it's like she's
Hmm.
feeling vulnerable enough to share. Right.
Hmm.
You are recognizing, oh, that's something that I can do. Like I can help by saying my name because
Hmm.
that's going to prompt your memory. I know there are other people who would, you know, maybe take advantage of that. Right. So this is an example of kind of the dysfunctional empathy because you could be able to predict how somebody's going to behave based on your assessment,
Hmm.
but it can be in a way that it's not to generate a pro-social outcome, it's to generate a self-interested outcome. And so I think to me, that's really the difference between like functional empathy and dysfunctional empathy, is kind of where you're going. Paige, I see your hand up too.
Yeah, I just want to I'm going to stop the recording. We don't have to stop talking because it's fabulous, but I am going to stop the recording.